Okay, so we are live now. Uh, let's start the lecture today. Today's session. Uh, Today's topic is Capitalism Part 2. So, Pranabda, over to you. You can start now.
Can the screen be seen?
Yes.
Okay. So we shall begin from where we left off. I have a sore throat, so I don't know how long I'll be able to continue, but let us start anyway. The central theme around which we are trying to elaborate our understanding of Marxism is overdetermination. That is, we said that overdetermination, Marxist philosophy, apart from mechanical materialism as well as idealism, that is all forms of essentialism. Flowing from this, our focus in the discourse on capitalism is that the process of exchange, just as in the uh, capitalist fundamental class process, is founded on violence, not on economic logic alone. So there is overdetermination, so there is economic logic, and there is also violence, political violence, religious violence, etc. Following Marx, we talk of the violence of dispossession of modes of production, of means of production, generally the meaning attached to primitive accumulation. A discussant pointed out that exchange has been the product of other types of violence too, in the slave economy and in economies outside the West that have been subjected to various kinds of violent dispossession by imperial nations. This was pointed out by Rajesh in our last lecture. I was thinking about that now. Though exchange economy may be the product of various violent routes of destruction of communities, you see, destruction of communities is the precondition for exchange because within the community, as we were saying, the social division of labor is achieved either generally through a consensus within the community. So, though exchange economy may be the product of various violent routes of destruction of communities, abstract labor value and surplus value emerge as analytical categories, as categories which are necessary for analysis in Marxist political economy only under capitalism. Now, why is that so? Because Marxist political economy, as we had argued, the focus is on exploitation. That is the political choice that Marx makes. Now, within the capitalist economy alone, exploitation is production and appropriation of surplus value, which is possible only when labor power exists as a commodity. Now, we discussed the reasons behind Marx starting the discussion of capitalism through commodities produced within simple commodity production, though his entry point into analysis is class. So, while his entry point into analysis of all of the capitalist fundamental class process, just as in other modes of production, is class, when he presents his analysis of capitalism, he begins with commodities. Why he does that, we argued in our previous lecture. We developed the concept of concrete labor, abstract labor, and commodity fetishism, and the allocation of social labor through the operation of the law of value within the analytical field of this simplified economy. This we did in our last lecture. Following Marx, we also argued that abstract labor as an affective concept, that is, as a concept which impacts the subjectivity of economic agents within capitalism. Following Marx, we argued that abstract labor as an affective concept comes into play only after the violence of primitive accumulation disrupts communities. We will today discuss the logical evolution of commodities from simple commodity producing bartered economy to capitalist fundamental class process. We will uncover the source of profit as surplus value. If time permits, we will discuss instances of the interweaving of cultural, political, and economic processes in the genesis and structure of capitalism. So, let us begin from the simple commodity producing economy and the simplest kind of exchange, that is a barter exchange. Commodities exchanging against commodities. C. These are this is the simplest kind of commodity exchange and simple commodity production. Now, exchange value is determined by abstract labor. Going back to our previous example, say one table sells against two shirts because one table requires as much abstract labor for its production as two shirts. Table has use value for, now why does this exchange takes place? Table has use value for weaver, that is the weaver requires a table, it has usefulness for the weaver, but it has only exchange value for carpenter. The carpenter is selling the table to the weaver. So the table does not have use for the carpenter. It only is useful as an exchange value, as something which you sell to get something else. So table has use value for weaver, exchange value for carpenter, and the opposite is true for the shirt. That is, in the case of the shirt, it has use value for the carpenter who's trying to acquire the shirt, and it has exchange value for the weaver who's trying to sell this shirt to get a table. So purpose of exchange is to obtain something qualitatively different from what you started with. That is, the weaver starts with shirt, wants to get table. The carpenter starts with table and wants to get shirt. So the purpose is to obtain something qualitatively different from what you started with. Now, this may not be that simple because the carpenter may not meet a weaver demanding a table. So the carpenter wants a shirt, but there may not be a weaver who wants a table. Then what does it do? Then the carpenter will say exchange it against a table against paddy, then paddy against wheat, and then ultimately he finds a weaver who wants wheat. Will give shirts against wheat. So he exchanges table, the exchange rate is 15 kg of paddy, gets, then he exchanges 15 kg of paddy for 20 kg of wheat, and then he gets the shirts, two shirts that he wants. So many exchange values, also called relative prices. One table is equal to 15 kg of paddy, one table is equal to 20 kg of wheat, one table is equal to two shirts, and similarly 15 kg of wheat will be. So you have so many exchange values. Now, so this process becomes very time consuming because the carpenter doesn't get shirts, a weaver who wants tables. So he has to go on through this process of exchange only in order to get something which he wants. Now, so it's time consuming and uncertain. He doesn't know whether he'll ultimately land up with something which he can give to the weaver. So, and there are so many relative prices to handle. So, from the dialectical contradiction of many relative prices emerges one absolute price. So now comes money into play, money price. So one table is equal to say rupees 400. Then 15 kg will also have the same price because one table exchange for 15 kg. So 15 kg will also be equal to rupees 400, and two shirts will also be equal to rupees 400. This is purely Hegelian dialectics. One, many giving way to one. Many, for instance, you have Hegel would argue like this, like the uh, building up of linguistic categories, that you have a pear tree, you have an apple tree, and you have this. The pear tree, you say that this is the only kind of tree. Then it is contradicted by an apple tree, which is another kind of tree. Then it is contradicted by an orange tree. It is contradicted by flower bearing trees and so on. And ultimately, from these various kinds of trees, you have one category, that is tree. So from many, you have one. And this is similarly from many relative prices, you have one absolute price, that is money price. But that doesn't solve the problem of long change of exchange. For this, trading has to emerge as specialized activity. There has to be a group of people who are traders, who are not producing anything but who are trading. Then the carpenter can sell the table to a furniture merchant, get rupees 400, and with this 400 rupees he goes to the garment trader and gets shirts. So he knows the location. He doesn't have to go around selling table against paddy and then paddy against wheat and so on. So that knows the location of the furniture merchant, sells the table to the furniture merchant, gets rupees 400, and gives the money to the garment trader, whose location is also known, to get shirts. The purpose of exchange for carpenter, as also weaver, remains the same. It was like in the barter. Get something, the shirt, who's giving shirt, that is the weaver, qualitatively different from what you started with, that is table. So that is, the carpenter starts with a table, gets shirt, and the weaver starts with shirt and gets table. So the purpose of exchange remains the same. Get something which is qualitatively different from what you started with. But now, just as you have CMC, there will be also another circuit interwoven with this, that is MCM. That is the circuit of the trader. So the trader starts and ends with qualitatively the same thing, money. Whereas the weaver and the carpenter started with one commodity and ended with another commodity, and the purpose of the exchange was to get something qualitatively different. In the case of the trader starts and ends with qualitatively the same thing, that is money. So the end must be to get quantitatively greater amount. So the circuit of the merchant would be MC M prime, where M prime is greater than N. So you start with M and end up with M prime being greater than N. But how would this happen? How could the trader get more money than what he started with? Consider the furniture trader. Either he gives less than rupees 400 to the seller of table, or he takes more than rupees 400 from the buyer of table, or it could be both. So the trader is gaining value through exchange because someone is losing value. So he is either buying a commodity at less than value, that is abstract labor value, or he is selling at more than abstract labor, so labor value. So the trader is gaining value through exchange because someone is losing value. Trader is, of course, a capitalist, because a capitalist is simply one who has invested a sum of money and at the end of the process gets a larger sum of money. So trader is a capitalist, as invested M expands to M prime, which is greater. Trader is unproductive capitalist. No value expansion on account of trade. There is only value transfer. So unproductive capitalist is one who doesn't who doesn't add any value. So this is exactly what the trader is doing. Through the process of trade, no value is being added. The trader is, of course, gaining value, but that is either because he or she is buying at a lower value or selling at a higher value, or both of these. Now, the next stage is the capitalist fundamental class process. The capitalist, the productive capitalist, starts with a sum of money again, M, buys commodities, that is inputs of production, C. Then there is a production process, converts this C into C prime, where C prime is greater than C. And this is what causes M prime to be greater than M. So starts with M, buys C, through the production process converts it into C prime, which is greater than C, and therefore this, and sells this at M prime, which is greater than M, because C prime is greater than C. So MC, this process, and C prime to N prime, these are exchange processes. The productive capitalist spends M money and gets C of commodities. Then again, after the production process ends up with C prime, sells C prime to get M prime. So both of these are exchange processes. C to C prime, this is the production process. For C prime to be greater than C, it is necessary that C must contain some commodity whose use in production adds more value. Production, that is conversion of C to C prime, adds more value to the product than its own value. So C must be containing some input which in the course of production adds more to the product, which is C prime, than its own value. There is only one such commodity, labor power. So now the laborer, as we had discussed, through primitive accumulation, the laborer has been dispossessed of all means of production. So the laborer has to sell labor power. Now, this labor power is what produces the surplus, which causes C prime to be greater than C. Now, to simplify, let us again go back to our simple assumption that abstract labor and concrete labor are the same. So we can measure labor value, we can measure in hours. Suppose that there is a table, there is a stable rule that the workday is 10 hours. Now, we have to assume that there is a given number of hours that the laborer works. So let us suppose that through bargaining between trade unions and the capitalists, the workday has been decided, has been fixed at 10 hours. That is, the worker works in the factory for 10 hours. Now, to live and work for a day, that is for 10 hours, the commodity basket that is deemed necessary by a particular society is produced with 6 hours of labor. Now, this is to live and work for a day. If you live and work for a day, then you put in 10 hours of labor. Now, to do that, there is a certain commodity basket which is deemed necessary by a particular society. Now, see, it is a socially necessary. This is deemed to be socially necessary, a basket of commodities. Now, this will obviously vary from society to society. Now, for example, in our society, it would not be considered necessary that the worker should have a television set or a refrigerator, but it would obviously be, it is deemed necessary in a Western country. So to live and work for a day, the commodity basket that is deemed necessary by a particular society is produced with, say, 6 hours of labor. So the laborer is working for 10 hours in the factory, but to work for 10 hours, one has to be sustained through the day, and for that, a commodity basket is necessary, which is produced with 6 hours of labor. Then the value of 10 hours of labor power is equivalent to 6 hours. So 10 hours of labor power are being embodied in C prime. That is the number of hours that has been worked by the laborer. This is embodied in C prime. But to acquire that labor power, 10 hours of labor power, only 6 hours of labor is necessary. So surplus value is equivalent to 4 hours, 10 minus 6. So this is the source of surplus value, the source of profit. This is where the profit arises from. Now, this is a schematic view of the entire production of surplus value, the production process, and the capitalist starts with a sum of money M1. With that sum of money, buys a commodity basket, which we call CM1. Now, this commodity basket, on the one hand, it has, say, you consider the function of weaving. So the owner of the loom spends M1 rupees to get a basket of input CM1, which includes yarn thread, which we call embodied labor. This is the raw material, embodied labor. Why? Because in the production of yarn, the labor has already been spent. It is built. It is then built into it is embodied in the yarn. So in this commodity basket, there is one part which is embodied labor, which Marx also calls constant capital. Why is it called constant capital? We will shortly explain this. So one part is embodied labor, the intermediate goods, the raw materials, etc. Now, another part is the weaver's labor, that is live labor. This is embodied labor and this is live labor. The weaver working on the loom, that weaver who is working for 10 hours, say, that is live labor. It is not embodied in a commodity. The laborer is entering and producing and selling 10 hours of labor power. Now, out of this 10 hours of labor power, part is live labor paid. This is the 6 hours, which is called variable capital. There are two kinds of capital. One is what is embodied, the raw materials, intermediate or the intermediate goods, or the wear and tear of machinery, which we call constant capital. And the other is what is paid to the laborer, that 6 hours. That is V, variable capital. Why we call this variable and why we call this constant, we'll discuss shortly. Now, and part of this live labor is 6 hours, which is paid to the laborer, live labor paid, and part 4 hours, which is not paid to the labor, unpaid labor, which is surplus value. So we have constant capital, you have variable capital, and you have surplus value. All these live labor and the embodied labor, they are combining to make CM2, the basket of commodities, that is the cloth. So you started with a basket of commodities, the capitalist started with the basket of commodities CM1, the inputs which contained yarn and also the labor of the weaver. Then this labor of the weaver and this yarn were combined to give CM2, the basket, that is the cloth. And this is then being sold to get M2, which is greater than M1. Why? Because M1 contains C and V. With this, the live labor, with the payment to live labor LLP, that is V. With this payment, with 6 hours of payment, you get 10 hours of labor power. So you have to spend this 6, and you have to spend whatever is the value of yarn. And this C plus V is this is producing, this V is the live labor is producing 4 hours surplus value. So CM2 contains C plus V plus S, and CM1 contains only C plus V, the value of constant capital and the value of variable capital, that is the value of labor power. So obviously there is an additional component S, and that is why CM2 is greater than CM1 and M2 will be greater than M1, and M2 minus M1, that is the profit, which is appropriated by the capitalist. So this is these black arrows, these represent the exchange processes. Rupees is being spent to get inputs, and then output is being sold to get rupees, M2 being greater than M1. And then these blue arrows, these are showing the production process where C and live labor, they are combining to get CM2. So this is the story of where profit arises from, the production of surplus value. Now, we have so far only discussed the capitalist fundamental class process, that is the process through which surplus is produced and appropriated by the capitalist. Now, apart from this, we had mentioned that there are various subsumed class processes which are necessary to sustain the capitalist fundamental class process. There will be the landlord industrial capitalist relation. This is a subsumed class process. Rent is paid for access to non-produced means of production. Like this could be land itself, this could be warehousing facility, whatever. This would be a subsumed class process, the process between the landlord and the industrial capitalist. So also would be the process between the merchant and the industrial capitalist. Now, the industrial capitalist is appropriating surplus value, as we have discussed. Out of this appropriate surplus value is paying to the landlord rent, is paying to the merchant markup, trader's margin, and this is being received by the landlords and the merchants. Why paying to the merchant? Because to ensure faster rate of turnover of capital. We have talked about this previously. Also, there is the relation between the state and the industrial capital. The industrial capitalist pays corporate tax. This is not necessarily equal to compensation for services of state for industrial capital to secure infrastructure. This is corporate tax. Why is it paid? It is for to get services from the state. What kind of services? Infrastructure, also law and order, protection of private property is very essential for the capitalists, because unless private property is protected, there's no guarantee of being able to sell the produced commodity in the market. Someone will seize it. So for all this, the industrial capitalist is willing to pay some tax, which is called corporate tax. Now, this is not necessarily equal to the services that the state provides to the industrial capital. Why? Because if the industrial capitalist can exercise sufficient power, the state will be uh, financing the building of infrastructure by squeezing income tax from those from non corporate sector to subsidize the corporate sector. So this will depend. This will be a political process. How much tax is extracted from the corporate sector itself to build the infrastructure to aid the corporate sector, and how much of it is financed by taxing the non-corporate sector. Now, the relation between the manager and the industrial capital, this is also a subsumed class process. The industrial capitalist is earning surplus value. Out of that is paying the manager to ensure that there is smooth production. Now, previously, at the birth of industrial capitalism, all this work of the manager used to be combined with the work of the capitalist, the work of the financier. All these used to be combined. Now they are segregated, and so since they are segregated, they are as if they are part of capital. They are being paid to do some activity which the capitalist is delegating to them. So also the shareholder. The shareholder is providing a part of the capital, which is previously the industrial capitalist would have to mobilize the entire capital himself or herself. Now, a part is being paid by those who buy the shares in the joint stock company, the shareholder. So for that, the shareholder gets something called a dividend. That is, in order to access capital not owned by the owner. This is not paid up capital of the capitalist. Actually, the paid up capital is only a very small fraction. Now, this is a long time ago when there was privatization had not become so much a talk of the day. There was a talk, this was during the 70s, there was talk of the government issued, this was the Janta government, they issued a white paper. They were talking about nationalizing Tisco. Now, not privatizing, nationalizing Tisco. Now, Tata brought out a white paper saying that, well, we own only, they were owning something like, as far as I remember, it was something like 23%, whereas the government, through the banks, etc., which were all state-owned, was owning more than 33%. So Tata's point was that, well, why do you have to nationalize? You can control, you can decide policies because you have a majority, you have a greater shareholding. So the actual paid up capital of who is the person who is considered to be the owner is very small compared to what is raised from the shareholders, and also what is accessed through payment from the financial sector. So finance capital and industrial capital. Finance capital, financial capital being the bank capital of the banks, etc., which the industrial capitalist takes on loan, and for that pays an interest to obtain loan capital. So all these subsumed class payments, they are out of the surplus value, which, as we discussed in our previous slide, is appropriated, produced by the laborer and appropriated by the capitalist, and then parts of these are paid out to the landlord, the merchant, the state, the manager, the shareholder, and to the banks, etc., in order to ensure smooth functioning of production and sale of produced goods. So subsumed class payments vary as a result of overdetermined cultural, political, and economic processes. You see, for example, as we were saying, the state corporate tax. Now, how much the state will take in corporate taxes in order to finance the construction of infrastructure, that will depend on the relative strength of the industrial capitalist association of the industrial capitalists and the political power of the common persons, because the income taxes that we pay out, that may be used to finance the infrastructure building for the corporate sector. Similarly, what part of surplus value the industrial capitalist will keep and what will have to be paid to the manager will depend on the bargaining power, and so also for shareholders, etc., etc. So, subsumed class payments vary as a result of overdetermined cultural, political, and economic processes. Wage determination too is a result of such overdetermination. Now, wage, as we were saying, that what is wage? Wage is this variable capital. Now, how much a wage will be paid, whether for 10 hours you get 6 hours, or you get 5 hours, or you get 8 hours, that will be a result of political bargaining between the trade unions and the capitalists. So, wage determination too is a result of such an overdetermined process. It is not. It is not as if this is a simple economic process like what mainstream economics teaches, that demand and supply will determine. It is a political process, a process of bargaining. All these payments impact profit. So the rate of profit is not determined by economic process alone, but is overdetermined by political and cultural processes. So so the point is that we say that the rate of profit depends on efficiency of production, efficiency of the workers, etc. But that is not the case. It all depends, it is all overdetermined. Hence, variations in the relative political strength of subsumed classes might impact the propensity to crisis of the system. Now, so for example, if the merchants, if the financial capitalists, they extract too much, then too little will be left to the industrial capitalists, and they will not be sufficient for expansion. So that will lead to a crisis. We'll talk about crisis in detail in a later lecture. Hence, variations in relative political strength of subsumed classes might impact the propensity to crisis of the system. This was most pronounced in the recent case of the financial crisis. Now, the financial crisis, which is also called the subprime crisis. Now, it emerged from the fact that a lot of loans were being given to people who were buying houses and who were not eligible to loans. That is, according to the criteria that the banks normally follow. They were not eligible, they were not reliable borrowers, but the financial sector was giving these loans. Why? Because the prices of property reality was rising at such a rate that the financial sector realized that even if our loans are not repaid, even if the interest is not repaid, we can we can secure these assets and sell it in the market. And because the prices of these assets are increasing at a much faster pace than all other assets, so by selling, we will be more than compensated for the loss of interest and loan given to the person who had purchased the land. So this was increasing. So this, they went on lending to people, and this lending itself pumped the demand for assets, reality, the land and houses, and it kept on, this inflation kept on going. Now, this is so this was a crisis which is created by expectations, and this was also a political, partly political, because the state, it conspired, it was complicit in this. The American state was complicit in this because the state did not enforce the normal rules which the bank should have followed in loaning. So the state was also seeing that the state is influenced by the capitalists, and capitalists were making the financial sector was making this huge profit. There was we are not going to the details of that how new institutions were created, etc., etc. But so there was a complicity of the state. This was political, and there was partly the anticipation, and so this went on, and ultimately somewhere someone along the line thought that, well, this is too much, and then decided to not to give the loans, to call back the loans. And once the loans were called back, the other financial parties who were also loaning out, they realized that the crisis is impending, so everyone started calling back the loans, and then the whole market for reality crashed. And this was the basis of the financial crisis. So this is all determined, over-determined by political processes. It was not just a economic process. So what we are saying is that the capitalist fundamental class process, this is a economic process, but within that also there is a political process inbuilt, because what would be the wages? That is determined not by economics alone, but beyond. After this surplus value has been extracted and converted into profit, part is paid to various kinds of subsumed class payments, and these are determined by the existing, what is the proper amount that should be paid to the worker, what is the proper amount that should be paid to the landlord, etc. These are determined by both the existing culture and also by the relative strengths, political strength of these various groups of people. Some of them are classes, some of these are non-class players. So this is all an overdetermined process, as we are keeping on insisting. So we come to the end of this section, which we, and this is the reference for this section. There's Capital Volume 1, and there is a article by Marguerite Gallery, and there's an essay by, there's a book by Rubin. So, we will move on to the next section. This is Capitalism, Capital Part 3. Now, can this slide be seen? Dipro, can you see the slide?
No, it's still the reference slide.
Oh,
You need to share it again.
I see. So can it be seen now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So we are starting on lecture 8, which is the next part of capitalism. Now, we have seen this, we have dealt with the development from CMC, MCM, CM prime, and then to the production of surplus value. We also see that abstract labor, which determines price, is a concept that emerges as a result of real abstraction in society caused by primitive accumulation. Real abstraction, real abstraction in the sense that people, they feel that there is something within the commodities which makes it exchangeable, some type of labor which we call abstract labor. So this is what we call real abstraction following Marx. Primitive accumulation breeds commodity fetishism, which we elaborated. In this lecture, we will detail the moments of overdetermination in the genesis and structure of capitalism. First, in the genesis and implications of primitive accumulation, the birth of alienated labor and the master-servant relation within the factory, and the relation with commodity fetishism. Second, we will discuss the variable, why we call V variable capital, and this is also a process of overdetermination. We will discuss this. And finally, in the origins and nature of capitalist crisis as discussed by Marx. So first of all, the question of primitive accumulation, the birth of labor power commodity and alienated labor. The emergence of the circuit of capital from the simple commodity circuit might appear to be simply a purely logical process. from Marx's discussion of commodity circuits. We had seen that CC, then CMC, and interwoven with that MCM. From there we go to MCM prime, M prime being greater than M. And next we go on to productive capital, M, C, C prime, M prime, where C prime is greater than M because it contains surplus value, and M prime is greater than M because C prime is greater than C. So this appears to be purely a logical development. Now, the emergence of the circuit of capital from simple commodity circuit may appear to be a purely logical process from Marx's discussion of the commodity circuits. But the final stage that incorporates production of surplus value depends on the emergence of labor power commodity. This emergence is not logical but is a product of violent primitive accumulation. But even the analysis of simple commodity producing market is based on abstract labor concept that emerges socially only as a result of primitive accumulation, the product of political violence. Now, we had seen Marx remarking this, that it is only when does all or even most of products become commodities, only in a particular kind of system, which is that is the capitalist system. Marx also remarks this. Now, it is only when the labor power itself has become the laborer has been deprived of all means of production other than the means of production, which cannot be taken away from him. That is the power to labor. Then the laborer has to buy from the market whatever is the minimum subsistence requirement. And in order to do this, as I said, labor power, it is only then when the mass of people have become laborers that the market becomes, the products become, all or most of them become commodities. So even even though we started simple commodity production, abstract labor as a concept emerges from primitive accumulation, which is the product of violence. We discussed this previously. For extraction of surplus value, laborer must be free in two senses. First of all, the laborer must have lost ownership of all resources necessary to complement labor in production, so that the laborer cannot embody his or her labor into a commodity and sell it to earn purchasing power as in simple commodity production. Under simple commodity production or petty production, what did the laboring person do? The laboring person produced with his or her own labor or family's labor, and because the person was in command of one's own labor, own and was in command of the tools of production. So whatever was produced with own or family labor, working on the tools owned by them, would then be the property of the direct laborer. And then this would be sold to earn purchasing power necessary to buy other things. But in the capitalist production, under capitalist production, the laborer has lost all the complementary means of production. For example, the weaver no longer owns the loom. So the weaver sells a labor power to the capitalist who owns the loom. The laborer must have lost ownership of all means of production and therefore is bound to sell the labor power. Also, so the laborer is free. This is in a sarcastic sense. Marx uses this. Is freed from all means of production other than the inalienable means of production, which is the power to labor. And the laborer must be free in a different sense, must be free to sell own labor, must be considered owner of own labor, unlike the slaves or the bondsman. Because the laborer is considered to be is free, so the laborer can sell the labor power to whomever he or she chooses. So for the extraction of surplus value from laborer, the laborer, one, must be freed from the ownership of means of production, and two, must be free to sell own labor power. And then enters a factory, sells labor power, and with the wages against this labor power, buys whatever is a subsistence basket. Dispossession by primitive accumulation creates the pauper. It is, once the weaver has been dispossessed of the loom, once the peasant's land has been taken away through the enclosure movement, which is taking away pastures and commons and driving the peasant away from the land. So once this has been done, where the peasant now is roaming, comes to the city in search of jobs. So the peasant owns nothing. The peasant is a pauper. The peasant is free in the first sense, dispossessed. Because he is free in the second sense, the pauper can seek employment in the factory. If he finds employment, he can sell his labor power, his only own productive asset. So it is only if one can find employment. So primitive accumulation creates what does not create the laborer, creates the pauper, the person who owns nothing. And only if the pauper meets with capital, which is not necessary. If the pauper meets with capital, then can sell labor power and become a laborer and can produce surplus value. Now, the role of primitive accumulation in the emergence of capitalism is of great significance. The logical journey of the commodity circuits to the circuit of capital has to be necessarily supplemented by the violence of primitive accumulation. So the journey from unproductive capital, MC M prime, the trading capital, to MC prime M prime, that is C to C prime, this production, when capital is being converted into productive capital, not merchant capital. This can be done only if the laborer, primitive accumulation has taken place, the laborer is dispossessed and so is forced to sell labor power, which is the only commodity which adds more value to the product than its own value. Adds 10 hours, its own value is 6 hours. So unless the laborer has been dispossessed of primitive accumulation, the laborer is not forced to sell his or her labor power, and then there can be no value generation within the capitalist mode of production. So the logical journey of the commodity circuits to the circuit of capital has to be necessarily supplemented by the violence of primitive accumulation. The process of dispossession is not a logical or market-driven process. This is particularly true, as Marx notes, in the case of dispossession of lands where forcible enclosure of commons was the major cause of peasants abandoning their rural homes. Primitive accumulation is an encounter or conjunction of processes that emerged from divergent reasons. There was dispossession of peasants by feudal lords through enclosure movement. This is, of course, a political thing. There was dispossession of artisans by merchants and master craftsmen through economic processes. That is, we discussed this, the merchants were combined in guilds which were more powerful, and therefore they could slowly they could extract more of the surplus, and the artisans got impoverished in the process. The master craftsmen, they were also powerful. They stopped the promotion of the apprentices and the journeymen to the status of master craftsmen, where they would employ people, and so they also had a monopoly power. So the merchants and the master craftsmen, using their monopoly power, they dispossessed the lower artisans through economic. This was an economic process. Accumulation of monetary, and apart from this, there's accumulation of monetary wealth through usury and trade. So all these were parts of primitive accumulation, and these were partly economic, partly political. Deployment of this monetary wealth to acquire means of production and buy labor power from dispossessed peasants and artisans. So this was the final point of primitive accumulation. The assortment of causes that also involve violence again emphasizes the role of overdetermination and attendant lack of teleology. That is, there is no determinate, it is not predetermined what will happen. See, all because the state was using political violence, peasants were forced away. Now, if the state could not use, if the political situation was different, then they would not be dispossessed. Now, there were instances where there was a reclamation by the peasants. So this is not it is not as if it is a predetermined process. So all these processes combined in an through over determination, and there is no there's no teleology in Marx. Now, primitive accumulation, the story of primitive accumulation constructed by classical political economy is quite different. And Marx lampoons this. I thought this would be an interesting piece to show the difference in the way in which mainstream economics approaches a certain process and the way in Marx approaches it. Marx talks of primitive accumulation within, as discussed by classical political economy. Now, this is a quotation in Marx, volume 1. This primitive accumulation plays approximately the same role in political economy as original sin does in theology. As in primitive accumulation, as discussed by classical political economy. Original sin, you see, in the Bible, God makes Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman. Then Adam is seduced by Eve to eat an apple, and this gives knowledge, and knowledge brings sin. And so this is Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote about the past. So, why is man toiling? Something happened in the past. This is the biblical story. And similarly, in the explaining primitive accumulation, classical political economy says the same kind of story. Long, long ago, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, the hardworking, intelligent, and above all, those who were frugal, that is thrifty, they were saving. The diligent, intelligent, and frugal elite, and the other lazy rascals, spending their substance and more, whatever they got, and even more, in riotous living. The legend of theological, so these people who were frugal, intelligent, they were saving, and these people were not saving. So the legend, this is like the original sin, Marx is saying. Legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how man can be condemned to eat his bread by the sweat of his brow. That is because he had sinned by eating the apple. So then God said that now you go out of paradise and live by the sweat of your brow. So every person would have to toil. This was the biblical story. But the history of economic original sin, that is original sin, lazy rascals spending everything they have. The history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. So there are these people, the diligent, intelligent, and frugal elite, who do not have to live by the sweat of by their own toil. So there is one class of people who have to toil, the other. Why do they not have to toil? Because they were frugal. And why does the other have to toil? Because they were not frugal. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sought accumulated wealth, and the latter sort finally had nothing to sell except their own skins. So this is a story that classical political economy says that this is purely an economic process, because some people saved and some people did. But the real story is that some people were deprived of the means of production through a violent process. So classical political economy is taking an essentialist route, arguing that this dispossession came about through an economic process, whereas the real story which Marx narrates is that this was an overdetermined process where political processes combined with economic processes to result in primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation has assumed a central role in the recent interpretations and extensions of Marxian political economy. In what sense? It is not considered primitive in the sense of prior. It is not as if it happened before and then capitalism came, and once capitalism comes, it's self-sustaining. It no longer has to rely on primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is part of the story of the birth of capital. But once capitalism, productive capital is born, it can sustain itself simply by appropriating surplus value, converting it into profit, then expanding capital. But it is not considered primitive in now. It is not considered primitive in the sense of prior, but in the sense of outside the discourse of capitalism. So what we now know is that primitive accumulation goes on and on. It is not, it doesn't occur within capitalism, it is outside. In that sense it is primitive. But Marx also indicates this, as we've seen above quote. It accompanies the extension of capital to newer fields. You see, whenever capital expands, for example, knowledge was not commodified. Now, through particularly through patent laws, TRIPS, etc., we know WTO has imposed this trade-related in intellectual properties, and there is an international regime in patent laws. Now, all this, what it does is to, it's a new kind of enclosure. So knowledge now becomes a property. So this keeps on going. There's then common property in seeds. These seeds were, the farmers were growing their crops. Part of this was kept as seed for the next season. But now you buy seeds, even if you cannot keep the seeds grown, you cannot keep a part of the crop as seeds, because this seed is also considered to be owned by the initial company from which you purchase the seeds. That is the law as it exists in the case of seeds, the right to property in the case of seeds. Now, we're not going to the details of that. So previously, seeds were grown by the farmer. They were used in the next season. Part of the crop was kept for growing in the crops in the next season. But now the property rights have been extended. You have to, first of all, because of the new varieties of new kinds of production, which is based on chemical fertilizers, pesticides, etc., etc. So you have to buy seeds, a high-yielding variety of seeds, and then whatever is produced by the application of these seeds becomes the seeds that you produce. If they are bought from seed companies, new seeds, the new seeds that you the part of the crop that you keep as seed, that is also considered to be the property of the company. So you have to change the laws as newer fields are taken into the capitalist circuit. In fact, as newer fields of production emerge, new laws and rules have to be formulated to prevent the extension of commons. For example, we know that now reproduction of material is so simple. Digital reproduction retains the fidelity, and we know that we rely so much on pirated books, pirated articles, pirated music, etc., etc. Now, in order to, so then the property, the commodity law, the capitalist system cannot bring this under its capitalist circuit. So then new rules and new laws have to be promulgated, and sometimes the state itself cannot implement these. So what do you have? You have, for example, nowadays even this laptop that I'm using, it has got a built-in Windows 11. So now, and this built-in and now Windows, you have pirated versions, but they're increasingly going about introducing methods through which you can have a surveillance whether pirated products are used, and if pirated software is used, then it will, there are built-in mechanisms which will not allow you to use extensions. Even in the case of organic reproduction, like previously when the farmer would grow vegetables, would grow crops on seeds which were produced within the farm. Now you have genetically modified. Now genetically modified seeds. Now, genetically modified seeds sometimes, why is this genetic modification necessary? It is argued that these are better, they produce crops which are look more wholesome, which are more productive per acre of land, etc., etc. But one major reason is that organic reproduction was something which was outside the field of human property rights. But once you introduce some genetic modification, you can say that, well, now I have introduced that, so I have the property right. So this is large part of the story between genetically modified seeds. So now, as capitalism reaches its boundaries, it has to bring newer commodities within the circuit of capital, knowledge, organic reproduction, etc., etc. And so, primitive accumulation is always going on. So it is not, in a sense, prior. This is the way in which we look at primitive accumulation since someone called Harvey talked about it. An aspect of primitive accumulation not discussed by Marx is imperialist accumulation. This is not primitive accumulation in the inaugural sense because it does not lead to the encounter of the dispossessed with capital. So, primitive accumulation from the colonies, these dispossessed people from their land, dispossessed people of their means of production, but the dispossessed people were not employed in capitalist enterprise. Why? Because this capital was taken away. Like Hobsbawm argues that Britain was the industrial leader, one, because it had India as a colony from where it extracted a large amount of wealth and inputs, and two, it had slave economies from which it could get, say, raw materials like yarn, etc. And three, it had also ultimately it used the Indian markets. So the story of primitive accumulation is interwoven with imperialism, but in the case of imperial dispossession, what was different was that the people who were dispossessed were not employed in the factories which were created because the capital was taken away and invested in the imperial center. Now, this idea of imperialism was first discussed by Lenin and developed in various directions within the broad genre of Marxist thought, and we will discuss this at a later point of time and in a later lecture. Another moment of overdetermination. One moment of overdetermination is primitive accumulation, the violence of primitive accumulation. Another moment is commodity fetishism and its relation with primitive accumulation. Now, this will take us a long way, but let me finish this slide. Freed from the means of labor, the peasant and the petty producer is at the same time released from his community. The first loses the means of production and is freed from the community. This is the moment when commodity fetishism becomes affective. That is, affective means part of our thinking process, part of our subjectivity. Because the community no longer distributes labor. Thus, the circumstances for real abstraction of abstract labor are the product of the violence of primitive accumulation. We had discussed this in our previous lecture. This is one of the reasons why Marx says, had we gone further and inquired under what circumstances all or even the majority of products take the form of commodities, we should have found that this can only happen with production of a very specific kind, that is capitalist production. We have discussed this quote before. The loss of community breeds a sense of individual property and personal labor generating personal property. You see, as long as people were living within the community, what one produced was not considered, one didn't think that it is my personal property. It was all the community's property and it was divided that way. Now, once you are freed from your community, whatever you produce, you consider that with your labor, you consider that to be your personal property. And so the need for exchange and comparison of otherwise concrete labors emerges, and so the notion of abstract labor. So once you're individually, you're freed from your community by through primitive accumulation. So you think that whatever is being produced with my labor, this is exchangeable because it is property, and then something must be common to that, and that is abstract labor. Though in the logical exposition of commodities come prior to capital, in the historical and analytical process, all or even most of the products cannot be commodities unless capitalism has been established. For the notion of exchange to be embedded in the mind of economic agents, they need to be torn apart from the community, and that can be done only through primitive accumulation. Thus, there is overdetermination between economic, political, and cultural processes. Political force is being employed for dispossession, economic, the birth of the idea of abstract labor, and cultural, this is embedded in the minds, becomes part of the subjectivity, private property, idea of private property, and so commodity fetishism. Primitive accumulation is not just historically political in the sense of violence and exclusion. It weaves politics into the apparently pure economic structure of capitalism. So, historically, it is necessary that violence is necessary to dispossess, but this also embeds violence into the very structure, working of capitalism. So, it is not just dispossession which is outside the circuit of capital. It is also, this embeds violence within the structure of capitalism. That is, the worker becomes a slave in the factory. Freed from the means of labor through primitive accumulation, the worker can only perform alienated labor. This leads to the slavery within the factory. We shall discuss this in our next class. So I think I'll end here, and if there are any questions, we'll take them. Yes. If there are no questions, then uh, shall I go on for a bit?
You
Yes.
can carry on for some time.
Rajesh.
I said that you can carry on for some more time.
Okay. So we had discussed this slide. So alienated labor, what is the significance of alienated labor? The laborer selling labor power, what is the significance of this kind of labor? How is it different from the labor which is performed by the petty producer? Now, human labor, as Capital Volume 1 says, is performed twice, in imagination and in reality. So, man realizes himself in labor. That is my humanness. This is real. This I realize only when I can labor. In what way? In perform human labor. That is one. I plan and I execute my plans. Laborer in capitalist production does not perform human labor. Laborer executes plan but does not plan. This is alienated labor. Alienated, this is a quotation from volume 1 of Capital. A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. He not only affects a change of form in the material on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own that gives the law to his modus operandi and to which he must subordinate his will. The less he is attracted by the nature of the work and the mode in which it is carried on, and the less, therefore, he enjoys it as something which gives play to his bodily and mental powers, the more close his attention is forced to be. You see, what Marx is saying here is that a lot of productive activity is carried on in the animal world. They are very beautiful, but they are different from human production, because human beings, they plan and they execute, and the less that we can plan, the more must I be forced to pay attention to my work, because my mind will wander. I have no interest in my work because I'm not planning. Now, you see, how does one prove that it is human beings who plan and not the beaver or the spider, etc., or the bees? Now, one simple reason is that, you see, for thousands of years, the spiders have been weaving their nets. The bees have been building their honeycombs, and there's been no change in the structure. But human beings, our dwellings, we keep on changing the material according to the availability, and then the plan, the structures have changed through generations. This is because we feel an abstract need of a dwelling place. We plan how to build what should be this dwelling place according to the available material, and then execute the plan. As long as this can be done, we are getting we are feeling that this is, we are living the life. We can feel the purpose of our life. So in everything that we do, this lecture that I'm giving, I'm planning and executing the plan, and this is giving me satisfaction. Now, if on the other hand, when I was teaching, I was teaching partly what I love to do, but partly according to a syllabus I was forced to teach. I was teaching, say, international trade, mainstream economics. Now, that was not something I loved to do, but I had to do it because that was the requirement of the syllabus, which is decided by a higher body. So this was not giving me any pleasure. So the less it gives you pleasure, the less you're attentive to it, and more will be the necessity of force, the UGC, etc., they come into play. Laborer has no interest in the work he or she does in the factory. Therefore, what does the laborer try to do? Convert labor time into lifetime. To capitalists, this is shirking or wasting time. So you have to be forced to pay close attention. Because wasting time, because the laborer is breaking the contract to work for a specific number of hours. But to laborer, it is simply converting labor time into lifetime. Coercion, therefore, coercion is necessary to make the laborer keep the contract. Equality outside the factory gate, master-servant relation within. To see a hierarchy, one must penetrate the surface of the market into production and go into production. So, what the classical political economy was claiming to be an equal there is a master-servant relation. Again, quoting from Capital, this sphere of exchange that we are deserting, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on. This is going on outside the factory. You are contracting, the capitalist is contracting with the laborer. This sphere of exchange that we are deserting, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. Eden, from which man was banished when he ate the apple. There alone rules freedom, equality, property, and bentham. That is outside the factory gates. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, say of labor power, are constrained only by their own free will. They are contracting of their own volition, of their own free will. The laborer is contracting to sell labor power. They contract as free agents, and the agreement they come to is but the form in which they give legal expression to their common will. This is something which is very Hegelian, that both are contracting, their will becomes common, the buyer and the seller's will. Equality. Why equality? Because each enters into relation with the other as with a simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalent for equivalent. The labor power, I'm selling my labor power, the worker is selling labor power for its value. So everything is selling at value. There is no coercion, apparently. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own. The worker owns only one property, the labor power, selling that, and getting paid the wages which is owned by the capitalist. And Bentham, because each looks only to Bentham said that people are egoistic. So the worker is looking at his own interest. Whether I'll work in this factory or that factory, whatever, wherever I get more wages. So the capitalist is also looking at one's own interest, trying to buy labor power at the lowest rate. So Bentham, because each looks only to himself, the only force that brings them together and puts them in relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interests of each. This is what brings them together in a sale deed. Each looks to himself only, and no one troubles himself about the rest. This is what Adam Smith said, that you don't have to think about all the markets will be coordinated through the invisible hand of the market. But auction, later on we talked of the mainstream talks of the auction here. So you just looked at the particular exchange that you are involved in. Each looks himself only, and no one troubles about the rest. And just because they do so, do they all in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an all-shrewd providence, work together to their mutual advantage for the common weal and in the interest of all? This is exactly what Adam Smith says. But on leaving this sphere of simple circulation or of exchange of commodities, which furnishes the free trader vulgaris with his views and ideas, free trader vulgaris, that is the classical political economy, who are peddling free trade, which furnishes the free trader vulgaris with his views and ideas, and with the standard by which he judges a society based on capital and wages. When we leave this sphere of circulation, we think we can perceive a change in the physiognomy, in the look of our dramatis personae, of the person who is buying the labor power and the person who is selling the labor power. He who before was the money owner now strides in front as capitalist. He walks in front. The possessor of labor power follows as his laborer. The capitalist walks in front, strides, and the possessor of labor power follows as his laborer. The one with an air of importance, marking, intent on business. The other, timid and holding back, like one who is bringing his own hide to the market and has nothing to expect but a hiding. Hiding means a beating. So you go into the factory, there is the master-slave relation. Outside, there is equality. So I will end here, and if there are questions, I will take.
Sir, uh, I'm P.S. Mukherjee.
Yeah.
I just want to ask a small question. Nowadays, this, in the wake of automation of production system, where the live labor, all these capitalist systems are reducing, and it is being replaced by artificial intelligence or automation or robotic production system. In that case, the constant labor part is increasing instead of light labor. So then, what will be the impact of this scenario on the total value system?
Now, within the Marxist framework, this is a very relevant question. We'll discuss this in greater detail when we talk of prices. But for the time being, very schematically, as you correctly say, this will increase the organic composition. And as we'll discuss in our next class, this increase in organic composition directly leads to a fall in the rate of profit. This can be one source of crisis. Other source of crisis, this will also lead to under consumption because you're replacing man with machine. So the purchasing, the number of purchases is going down. So this will lead to different kinds of crisis. This is what the Marxist theory predicts. But there are various countervailing factors which may come into practice, and you can uh, mm, and different kinds of imperialism, or you can pass on the crisis to the outside of capital. There are ways in which this can be done. We'll discuss this when we take up the question of imperialism and capitalist crisis, things which cannot be discussed totally within the framework which was enunciated in Marx. We have to think of later works also.
I think there are no more questions. So let's end the session here. And we are meeting again in the next Friday, on next Friday, sharp at 8 p.m. Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Good
everybody, and
night.
good night.